Trevor, if the room is full, I'm going to go back across the street where I live. I'll come back to the meeting.
Aaron, pagaste et Trevor? Nee, cigot. Last person was at the
David Rose.
The Asserson report.
Hi. Just meet Trevor. It's Howard Reitsband. Howard represents the Canadian community. Welcome to all of you for this lecture by Advocate Trevor Asserson. Acknowledge the presence of our president of the center, Ambassador Dory Gold. We also, I don't think I've announced it, our new acting director general, Chaya Hershkovitz, who's here on the front row. I would like to make a couple of announcements. The first one is we intimated that Abe Foxman might speak here, but we have to delay that. We have Carol Solomon, who is the chair of the Board of Governors of the Jewish Agency, here on the 1st of March. It's a Monday at 10 o'clock. She'll explain the inner struggles in the American Jewish community about fundraising for Israel. Those who want to, who think that American Jewry should not make emergency campaigns for Israel against those who think it should. And she has been strongly, as chair of the Board of Governors of the Jewish Agency, been strongly involved in that. I would also like to ask all the journalists among you that if they write about this meeting, that this lecture, they mention the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. I usually very, very briefly mention the main anti-Semitic events since we met last time. Obviously, one of them, not very well known because it's in French, is a book by a non-Jewish philosopher called Milner in France, which is entitled The Criminal Inclinations of Democratic Europe, in which he claims that anti-Semitism is an integral part of European culture and is likely to remain so because much of the action against the Jews and Israel now is executed by younger people. It's in particular among the younger generation that you find this violent anti-Israel action, both Arabs and leftists. This is, by the way, supported by a poll in Italy, which shows that about 20% of the children between 14 to 18 in Italy have strong anti-Semitic inclinations. We see another strong, interesting phenomena, which I am inclined to call hermaphrodite anti-Semitism. The European community, which is on the one hand has been the arsonists of the anti-Israel actions with their strong condemnations and really almost criminal condemnations, now suddenly tries to be the fireman. We have seen the most unusual things, like the president of Austria being shown on a picture being blessed with his hands on his head by a Chabad rabbi, Prodi traveling as president of the European community to be an attendant at the conference of European Chabad rabbis in Vienna. So we see this extremely strange phenomenon that the arsonists have become firemen, and at the same time others remain arsonists. Typical case now is Chirac, who told Israel Zinger that not so long ago that the Jews are the cause of all anti-Semitism, and now has come out in November saying that whoever hurts a Jew in France hurts the Republic. So we see this double-faced Europe, and this is a phenomenon which is going to be more and more stronger and stronger. Now to our lecture of today. We have On the outside, we have the basic interview in the Jerusalem letter with Trevor Asserson, where he explains in, let's say, in a shortened way, all the major claims he has against the BBC, which you can find on his website, where there are at least 150 pages of detailed accusations against the BBC. We have also put on your chair some additional material, an article which Trevor at the end didn't publish, a press release he put out, and most amazing, a letter we received from the BBC, which said that from the Director of News, that they really regretted it, that in the Jerusalem letter we did not give them the right of response. Now, we now get the most absurd situation which I've seen for the last few weeks. This minor media, the BBC, which doesn't let Israel come express itself in a fair way, appeals to the major media, the Jerusalem viewpoints, in order to get the right of response. I really recommend you to read to read the letter from the BBC. I have great admiration for Trevor, because he really embodies a phenomenon which we see in the last few years, which is the privatization of the struggle, where the Jewish organizations have really failed to deal with the many major problems in the field of media discrimination, attacks on Israel, anti-Semitism. Private people have taken their place. Trevor, at his own expense, with a major effort, has done what is probably the most detailed media study we have seen in the last few years, and he has done it in a very original way, because he has taken the contract which the BBC has with the British government, and he has analyzed what the obligations are, and he shows how the BBC is in breach of all the 15 principles which that contract embodies as far as reporting on Israel is concerned. You can find that there in the Jerusalem letter interview with him, which we have out there. Trevor is a senior litigation lawyer. He heads the litigation practice in London of one of the largest international law firms, and I'm very glad that he will give us the sequel to our first story there. Today he will tell us how do we go further with the BBC. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to give you a few words about why I started this project, why I think it's important to concentrate on the BBC, and I'm then going to give one or two examples of particularly appalling examples of journalism by the BBC, and then concentrate on how one takes the debate further beyond that, looking at Hutton and the implications of Hutton and the structure of the BBC, both within itself and as it sits within English society. I became concerned, like I think so many other Jews, perhaps I would like to think many other people, at what appeared to be a very one-sided portrayal of the Palestine-Israel problem during the first months of the Intifada. And having failed to persuade others to conduct a study along the lines of the one I conducted, I decided just to do it myself. And I should say there's a background, because as I was training, or shortly after I'd qualified as a lawyer, I was instructed by two of the major political parties in the UK to bring an action against the BBC because they were complaining that they weren't getting enough TV coverage. And through that action, I saw the method which could work, and which in fact did work, to bring a real benefit to those claimants. So I decided to use the same forensic style as Manfred has just explained, analysing the contractual obligations of the BBC, analysing their performance by recording over several months the output of all the major news stories, and then comparing those major news stories and that coverage with their obligations. And of course, in order to do that properly, you have to know what the truth is, insofar as the truth can ever be established. So I tried to look at other sources, Haaretz, the Jerusalem Post, to take the left and right wing views within Israel, one or two English newspapers, and also the New York Times, just to get an idea. And I reckon that if something was covered in all of those sources but omitted by the BBC, then probably it happened, and the BBC was simply omitting it. What I found is in my reports, and it shows that there was continuous, on the whole, fairly subtle failures of the BBC to report accurately. They would report part of a story. And I give an example as a paradigm, although in fact this is probably not a real example. They would report on many occasions that ambulances were not allowed to get through checkpoints, and how appalling is this, that even an ambulance, this is only for health reasons and people might die, was not allowed through, but they would fail to report the number of times that the ambulance was being used to carry weapons or terrorists. So simply by omission, they changed the story completely. Now, I'm going to give a few examples where they report what is in effect the opposite of the truth. It's not quite a lie, because all the facts that they give you are true, but it's the opposite. The impression given is the complete opposite of the truth. For example, in June 2002, when Bush gave his famous speech on the White House lawn, in which he castigated the Palestinians and the PA, never mentioned Arafat's name, and I think as time goes by, we'll see that as a watershed event from the date from which Arafat was no longer on speaking terms with the White House. And there were 19 paragraphs of a 28-paragraph speech attacking the PA, calling them terrorists, calling them corrupt, and throwing all sorts of insults at them. And derech agav, there were a couple of points made, and Israel also has to do something to improve relations or whatever. But it was clearly seen by everybody as a huge attack against the PA. And all of the news providers reported it as such, except for the BBC. And the BBC reported it as a very even-handed assessment of what was going on, giving the impression, making only one comment about the criticisms against the PA, and that was sandwiched between two comments of criticism about Israel, giving the impression to anyone that listened that, in fact, really he'd made no particularly interesting statement at all, whereas really this was a massively interesting policy change being signalled by the White House. So the impression given was the very opposite of the truth. Bush visited London last November, and the Guardian newspaper, which I would imagine many of you know is not massively friendly towards Israel, or indeed supportive of Bush or the war, carried out a poll. And they established on their poll that 32% of the population of the UK were opposed to the visit of Bush. Maybe 33, I don't remember the number exactly, but it was low 30s. The BBC that evening, in their major news programme on Radio 4, interviewed a number of people about Bush's visit. They interviewed 12 people that I counted, 10 of whom were opposed. That's 83%, and one was neutral. So they turned a 32% into an 83%. Anyone listening to the BBC would have come away thinking, well, the entire, almost the whole of Britain is utterly opposed to the visit of President Bush, creating, again, the image of the very opposite of the truth. It can get even worse, because as some of you will, and probably all of you are aware, the BBC finds the word terrorism and terrorists rather difficult to cope with. I've only monitored the BBC for a couple of months here and there, and I'm by no means monitoring all the time. But on two occasions when I was monitoring, the BBC reported speeches which I found rather strange, quoting Sharon and Bush on two completely different reports. They said words to the effect, Bush decried the acts of these militants, and Sharon decried the acts of these militants. So I asked my researcher, I said, go and look up these speeches. You know, this was a speech to the UN, or these were speeches being quoted by the BBC. Because I found it astonishing, the idea that the word militant would have come out of Sharon's mouth in these circumstances. And of course, the words were actually terrorist. So here, the BBC is so upset at the fact that the word terrorist is to be used, they will actually lie. They will actually change the words of a speech rather than report what actually happened, which I find astonishing level of dishonesty in terms of their reporting. I don't say that's the norm, but that is the level to which they will stoop at times. Now, why is the BBC so massively important? I think the BBC is unquestionably the dominant opinion former in the UK, and being English-speaking is probably, I think, the most important opinion former in the world. It's almost certainly the largest. It transmits on television, radio, and a very, very powerful internet, which is used as a huge educational tool in schools, certainly in the UK and probably around the world. It has 2,000 journalists on its news staff. It produces 5 hours of news per hour of the day, 24 hours a day, 365 days of the year. And it's producing this vast wealth of news under a particular brand, the BBC. Now, what everybody knows about the BBC around the world, I should say it reaches 152 countries, and in the UK it reaches over 90% of the population. And the brand that the BBC has is it produces fair, accurate reporting. If you want to know what Murdoch thinks, then you look at his output. If you want to know what America thinks, then you might look at some various American channels. If you want to know the truth, you look at the BBC. That's the image that the BBC has. So it's massively powerful, way beyond its already extraordinarily considerable means. And that's why I think the BBC is probably the certainly the most powerful, and if it's antithetical to Israel, then the most dangerous PR and news producer and opinion former that we have in the world. What I want to look at, and I think that I'm assuming that the people in this room have accepted, either based on their own opinions and I hope to some extent supported by my own work, that the BBC is antithetical towards Israel. It's not prepared fairly to portray Israel's side of the story. What I want to do is analyse the position that the BBC has within society and to consider quite how dangerous it is and how arrogant it has become. And I'm going to do this in the context of the Hutton report, which was produced a few days ago, a couple of weeks ago, and which, unfortunately, whose message has unfortunately tended to get lost in the news which has emerged subsequently of whether or not there are weapons of mass destruction, and Bush and Blair both deciding to have investigations on whether there were weapons of mass destruction at all, whether the intelligence gathering that led to the war was adequate. That whole debate has tended to swamp the Hutton report. And I don't think it should, and I hope that the Hutton report will bounce back and come into focus. The BBC is this massively powerful opinion former, and it sits within a theoretically fair and open democracy in a completely anomalous way, because there is no way in which one can control the BBC. If you think of the different ways in which one can control an organisation, first of all, you can vote for it. Well, no senior officers, no officers at all within the BBC are subject to election. So the British people who pay £4 billion a year for it have no say whatsoever in who runs it or how it's run. Then you have the market. Well, because because the BBC is funded by a tax, there is clearly going to be no market forces upon the BBC. They've recently put out 7 digital channels, and they had a survey as to how many people were watching one of these channels. On one of the surveys, one channel registered nil. There's no one watching it at all. Now, no commercial organisation could survive that kind of activity. The BBC can, because the British people are paying it £4 billion a year to do so. Then you look at the courts. Now, it's quite obvious, you would think, that the court does have power over the BBC. The reality is different. First of all, you can't, if you don't pay your licence fee, then you will be given a few days free bed and board at Her Majesty's pleasure in prison. But you won't gain any other benefit from it because it's a tax. It's nothing to do with the contractual relationship with the BBC. What you can do is complain that the BBC's coverage doesn't properly reflect a particular view. To do that, you have to have locus standi before the courts. You have to represent a body that the BBC has an obligation towards. If I were to bring proceedings against the BBC, they would claim I have no locus standi, I'm just an individual. It's possible that the Board of Deputies, as a representative of the entire Jewish population, could bring an application, but it's unlikely that they would take a political stance of that kind. Let's assume you overcome that almost insuperable problem. What you have to then demonstrate is not that the BBC has, on this particular instance, broken its obligations. What you have to demonstrate is that over a period of time, and who knows what period that may be, the BBC has produced coverage that is so demonstrably unfair that no reasonable broadcaster could conceivably have actually performed in this way. It's what's known as the reasonableness test for judicial review. The bar is set deliberately very, very high. It's far, far higher than a mere breach of contract balance of probabilities test. It's a test which is almost impossible to attain in something as nebulous as, is the coverage of Israel adequately fair to one side or another? And if one were bringing such an action, you've got the entire force of the BBC and their huge legal department and their external lawyers to contest with. They would have access to all of the materials of the BBC archive and would be able to put up a very stout defence. If you won, then you would be subject to the fact that the BBC could, the next day, start producing anti-Israel programmes again. And you'd have to go through the whole process all over again. So the courts are not an effective brake upon the BBC's power. Parliament. In theory, Parliament is a check to the BBC, to any organisation within the UK. The reality is, and I spoke with people very close to Margaret Thatcher, who privatised everything in sight, but never dared touch the BBC. And those were the words I was told. She never dared touch the BBC. Because the BBC, had they been the target of privatisation, would have been able to whip up enormous public support against Margaret Thatcher, against the government of the day. Now, we've had an extraordinary event in Hutton, where Blair, clearly the most successful Labour parliamentarian ever in the history of the Labour Party, so his position in history is assured, facing no opposition at all, because at the time Ian Duncan Smith was, in theory, leading the Conservative Party into the wilderness and was completely hopeless. The only thing the Conservative Party was united about was the fact that he was no good. And had a massive majority, and he caught the BBC out in a total lie. They said that he had lied to Parliament in order to persuade the British people to go to war. And he knew he was right. Even under those circumstances, when he complained to the BBC, his complaint was rejected, and I'm going to come on to that in a moment. And what has actually happened, I say luckily, that's a terrible word to use, fortuitously, albeit very sadly, Kelly killed himself. Dr. Kelly killed himself, which was a trigger which enabled the government to say, well, we now need an inquiry. And that inquiry was able to look at the BBC's systems of analysing their complaints procedure, and was able to produce a finding that in fact the government was right, the BBC had lied. Notwithstanding that finding, the government finds itself massively on the back foot. Now, if, after all the flack that Blair has taken from his attack on the BBC, and doubtless the flack that's coming in the future, under the particular circumstances of his analysis of the BBC, it's almost inconceivable that such a set of circumstances would arise again within British politics, within our lifetimes. And if it does, any Prime Minister will look at what happened to Blair and will say, whoa, let's stand back and let's avoid attacking the BBC. Unless there is general public recognition that the BBC needs to be changed. Because until it's seen as a popular issue, I think any politician is going to stand clear. We've got two things left. One defence is the complaints procedure, and another defence is the governors. Now, the complaints procedure is, as I've written in this article here, a complaints procedure which any dictator would be very proud to have as his judicial system, because he would be able to sit quite secure. The laws of natural justice require that a person should know the case being brought against them, that they should be able to speak in their own defence, and that they should be able to appear before a fair judicial